Hello and welcome. In this video tutorial, I want to help you how to complete the square. Let's begin by reviewing the definition of what it means to complete the square. We begin with a binomial of the form x squared plus bx. Now, if we add the quantity b over 2 raised to the second power, we're going to result with a perfect square trinomial. The key takeaway is that the b over 2, that's half of the coefficient of x. What's nice about this perfect square trinomial is that we can exchange that for a binomial squared, something raised to the second power. And in order to do that, we just grab x and add it to half of the coefficient of x. After that, we square it. And that's how we complete the square. Note that this only works if your leading coefficient is 1. Now, the formula itself looks a little bit intimidating, but I promise you that it's very straightforward to utilize. So let's look at our first example. Example 1, complete the square and write as a binomial squared. Here we need to add the number that will make this into a perfect square trinomial. And in order to identify such number, we're going to be using this recipe, getting the b term, dividing it by 2, and then squaring it. The b term is the coefficient of x. In this example, that's going to be the negative 10. So I'm going to grab negative 10, divide it by 2, and then I will square that. I will begin by simplifying what's inside of the parentheses first. Negative 10 divided by 2 is going to give me a negative 5. And negative 5 squared, that's going to be a positive 25. In order to complete the square using these two terms, I need to add a value of 25. Now that I have the perfect square trinomial, I can exchange it for a binomial squared. And here's how I can do it. I'm going to grab x, and I'm going to add half of the coefficient of x. But remember that we already did that. That's going to be negative 5. And adding by a negative is the same thing as subtracting. So here, we're going to do x minus 5. We're going to raise that to the second power, and we have the binomial squared. This is the perfect square trinomial. This is the binomial squared. Let's look at example 2. Complete the square and write as a binomial squared. Just like in example number 1, we need to find the value that when we add it to these two terms, we will result in a perfect square trinomial. And to identify such value, we can follow this recipe. We can grab the b term, divide it by 2, and then square it. Keep in mind that b is the coefficient of x. So in this example, that's going to be the 28. So I'm going to grab 28, divided by 2, and then I will square that. I'll begin by simplifying what's inside of the parentheses. So 28 divided by 2, that is going to be a 14. And then 14 being raised to the second power, that's going to be 196. So in order to complete the square using these two terms, I need to add a value of 196. And now I have the perfect square trinomial. To get the binomial squared, I'm going to grab x, and I'm going to add half of the coefficient of x. So half of 28, remember that we already did that, that's going to be 14. We raise that to the second power, and we have the binomial squared. Again, this one's the binomial squared. The first one is the perfect square trinomial. So far, we've been completing the square with even numbers. So let's see what happens when we try to do it with an odd number. So example 3, complete the square and write as a binomial squared. Just like in the two previous examples, we need to find the value that when we add it to these two terms, we will result in a perfect square trinomial. And in order to identify such value, we can get the b term, divide it by 2, and then square it. And recall that the b term is the coefficient of x. Here, that's going to be the negative 7. So we're going to grab negative 7, divide that by 2, and then we're going to square that. We begin by simplifying what's inside the parentheses, but we immediately realize that 2 doesn't divide 7 evenly. So we're going to keep it as a fraction. We're not going to reduce to a decimal. We're going to leave it as is. And now we're going to square both numerator and denominator. So here we're going to get negative 7 squared is positive 49. And then 2 squared is going to be 4. In order to complete the square using these two terms, we need to add a value of 49 over 4. And we have the perfect square trinomial. To get the binomial squared, we get x, and we add half of the coefficient of x. So half of -7, that's just the -7 over 2. And remember that adding by a negative is the same thing as subtracting. So we get x minus 7 over 2. Squaring that, we now have the binomial squared. Now would be a good time for you to practice these on your own. So I'll leave you with some try problems. Give them a shot, and the solutions will present themselves in 3, 2, 1. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.